Imagine a line winding through the hills and mountains like a sleeping dragon, whose scales are blocks of stone and whose breath is the wind of centuries. What is this line? It is the Great Wall, one of humanity's most magnificent creations, a symbol not only of defense, but also of incessant labor, perseverance, and the pursuit of security, stretching across millennia. How did this colossal structure, seemingly part of the landscape itself, come to be? And what lies behind its majestic stones, beyond stories of battles and emperors? Today, we will embark on a tranquil journey through time to touch the history of the Great Wall, exploring its birth, development, and transformation. We will listen to the whispers of the past, listening to the rhythm of history like a soothing melody, to understand how this ancient structure became more than just stone and mortar, but a living testimony to human genius and resilience. Our immersion will begin at the very origins, when the idea of defense was just taking shape. We'll see how the disparate fortifications erected to protect against raids gradually began to merge into something greater. Then we'll follow the ambitious plan of the first emperor, who united the disparate sites into a single system. We'll learn about the scale of the construction, the materials that formed the basis of this titanic task, and those who, through their labor, sometimes arduous, turned this dream into reality. We will travel through the centuries, observing how the wall changed, adapted to new challenges, and transformed under the influence of successive dynasties. From the Warring States period, when the first ideas for defensive lines emerged, to the Han Dynasty, when the wall became a guardian of the Silk Road, opening trade routes and protecting caravans. We will see how, during periods of fragmentation, new sections were built, reflecting changing defensive tactics, and how the Sui and Tang dynasties, and later the Song, sought to maintain its significance while facing new threats. Our journey will continue through the eras of Mongol rule, when the wall seemed to have lost its former role, to its grand revival during the Ming Dynasty. It was during this period that the wall acquired its most recognizable appearance, becoming the embodiment of power and engineering skill. We'll learn about new materials and the construction of numerous towers and fortresses designed to provide reliable protection. We'll then touch on the dramatic moments when the wall faced the onslaught of the Manchus and see how, despite all efforts, it failed to prevent the fall of the Ming Dynasty. Following this, we'll trace the wall's transformation during the Qing Dynasty, when its defensive significance gave way to cultural and historical importance. We'll see how it became an object of study and then an attractive destination for travelers, marking the beginning of its preservation and restoration. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the Great Wall became a symbol not only of China, but of all humanity, and was recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. We will discuss modern conservation efforts and its significance today. And, of course, we will explore the legends and myths that surround this ancient structure, the stories of its builders, spirits, and heroes, which add even greater depth to the wall. We will also delve into the architectural and engineering solutions employed at various stages of construction, understanding how technologies and materials evolved to create this wonder of the world. Finally, We will conclude by reflecting on the Great Wall as a living testimony to history, a symbol of resilience and the eternal search for security, and its significance for our future. It will be a journey filled with peace and discovery, where every step will lead us deeper into history, allowing us to touch eternity through the prism of dreams. We begin our journey into the depths of time, to the very origins of an idea that would later be embodied in a grandiose structure known throughout the world. Imagine China long before it became a unified empire. This was the time known as the Warring States period, spanning approximately 5 centuries, from the 5th to the 3rd century BCE. During this time, numerous independent states existed across the vast lands of what would become China. These states, such as Qi, Chu, Yan, Han, Zhao, Wei, and Qin, were frequently in conflict, vying for power, territory, and resources. In such a volatile environment, when peaceful coexistence was the exception rather than the rule, the rulers of each kingdom sought to secure their domains. Defense became a top priority. It was then that the first fortifications began to appear, a kind of precursor to the future Great Wall. These were not single continuous structures, but rather scattered sections of walls built along the borders of individual kingdoms or to protect key cities and strategically important passes. The primary purpose of these early walls was to protect against raids from neighbors and incursions by nomadic tribes from the north. Imagine the countryside of that time. Fields sown with millet and wheat, small villages surrounded by palisades, and, of course, the fortified cities themselves. Walls were built where they were most needed, along trade routes, or where the natural landscape offered favorable defensive positions. The building materials used during this period were primarily those available locally, often rammed earth. Construction specialists erected wooden frames and then filled them with carefully compacted earth, layer after layer. This method, known as Hung Tu, allowed for the construction of relatively strong and high walls. In some cases, especially for fortresses and watchtowers, sun-baked stones or bricks were used. These were labor-intensive processes, requiring considerable effort and human resources. Life during the Warring States period was primarily tied to agriculture. Peasants cultivated the land, grew crops, and raised livestock. Craftsmen created essential utensils, weapons, and clothing. But the constant threat of war brought its own changes. Many men, in addition to their primary occupations, were required to undergo military training and be prepared to defend their homes. The construction of defensive structures, such as these early walls, also became part of their lives. It was a collective effort aimed at ensuring the security of the entire community. Imagine what construction was like back then. Groups of men armed with simple tools, shovels, picks, baskets for carrying earth, toiled under the scorching sun or pouring rain. The work was hard and monotonous. Building even a small section of wall required weeks, sometimes months of labor. However, the knowledge that these walls protected their homes, families, and crops gave them strength. These scattered walls, though not a unified whole, played a significant role in history. They were the first steps toward the creation of larger-scale defensive systems. They demonstrated the effectiveness of fortifications in protecting territories and became the prototype for what would later become some of the most impressive structures ever constructed by humanity. This was a time when the idea of defense, the idea of creating a barrier against external threats, began to take its first, modest, yet profoundly important shape. And so, when the disparate walls of the past began to coalesce into a coherent picture, an era arrived that changed the course of history. It was a time of great unification, a time when China finally freed itself from its fragmentation. In the 3rd century BCE, more than 1900 years ago, an emperor sat on the throne of the state of Qin whose name is forever inscribed in the annals. His name was Qin Shi Huang. This ruler, the first emperor of a unified China, possessed a grandiose vision. He didn't simply inherit disparate fortifications. He saw in them the potential to create something truly monumental. The idea of building a single, extended wall capable of protecting the new, unified state from invasions from the north became his primary strategic project. Qin Shi Huang ordered the existing sections of the wall to be connected and reinforced, and the construction of new ones to begin. This was more than just a defensive structure. It was a symbol of the new empire, a symbol of its strength and unity. Construction on a scale never before seen required enormous human resources. And here we encounter one of the darkest chapters of this history. Forced labor was used to realize the emperor's grandiose plan. Millions of people, soldiers, peasants, criminals, and sometimes entire families exiled to remote areas, were conscripted for the work. Their lives became an endless cycle of toil, deprivation, and suffering. Imagine this scene. Vast crowds of people moving across mountain ranges and desert plains. They carried stones, compacted earth, and dug ditches. The work began at first light and ended at nightfall. Conditions were harsh. Meager food, lack of proper rest, a harsh climate. Many succumbed. It is said that the remains of thousands of builders lie within the walls of this first Great Wall, their labor becoming part of the structure itself. It was labor that paid for not only with sweat, but with lives. However, despite all the horrors, construction progressed. The materials used were those available locally. In some places, this included compacted earth and gravel. In others, stones hewn from local cliffs. The technologies were simple but effective for their time. The main thing was the emperor's will and a huge, mobilized workforce. This first Great Wall, built under Qin Shi Huang, was far longer than any previous structure. It stretched for thousands of kilometers, encircling dangerous territories and blocking the main invasion routes of nomads. Its strategic importance was undeniable. It served not only as a physical barrier, but also as an early warning system, allowing troops to be quickly deployed to threatened areas. The lives of ordinary people during this period were closely tied to the needs of the state. Peasants continued to cultivate the land, but their labor was now often directed toward supporting construction projects. They supplied food and fodder, transported materials. Artisans made tools and clothing for the workers. The military served not only as protectors, but also as overseers. This was a time when the state played a dominant role in all spheres of life, subordinating the will and labor of its subjects to achieve great goals. Despite its brutality, Qin Shi Huang's construction of the wall laid the foundation for future defensive systems. It demonstrated the feasibility of creating a unified, extended defensive line capable of protecting vast territories. This wall, although not preserved in its original form to this day, became an important milestone in Chinese history, a symbol of power and unity achieved through enormous effort and sacrifice. And this was only the beginning. Following the grandiose construction begun by the first Qin emperor, Shanghai, a period began when the idea of the Great Wall was not forgotten, but rather developed. The Han Dynasty, which came to power in 1200 BCE, inherited this grand defensive concept and significantly expanded it. Han emperors, such as Emperor Wu, who reigned from 147 to 186 BCE, saw the wall not simply as a defensive structure, but as a key element of state policy, particularly in the context of expanding trade routes. It was during the Han Dynasty that the Great Wall began actively protecting what would later become known as the Silk Road. This was a period of flourishing international trade, when caravans laden with silk, spices, and other valuable goods traveled west from China. The wall, stretching for thousands of kilometers, was intended to protect these trade routes from raids by nomadic tribes such as the Xiongnu, who constantly threatened the empire's northern borders. Fortified sections of the wall, watchtowers, and garrisons of soldiers along the Silk Road created a relatively safe corridor for merchants. The construction of the wall during the Han Dynasty differed from previous stages. While rammed earth was often the primary material used under Qin Shi Huang, Han builders began to use stone and brick more widely, especially in strategic areas. This made the wall stronger and more durable. New architectural and engineering solutions were developed. For example, watchtowers became more complex, serving not only for observation, but also for storing supplies, billeting soldiers, and even signaling with smoke during the day and fire at night. The system of signal towers allowed messages about approaching enemies to be transmitted with incredible speed from one end of the wall to the other. People's lives during this time were, of course, tied to the wall. In addition to the soldiers who manned the wall itself, many were engaged in its maintenance and repair. Peasants continued to work the land, but their labor also provided food and resources for the builders and garrisons. Craftsmen made bricks, tools, and weapons. Merchants, enjoying the relative safety, transported goods. Naturally, construction required enormous human resources and forced labor, although to a lesser extent than under the Qin, was still used. However, overall, the Han period was a time of relative prosperity and stability, and the construction of the wall, while difficult, did not result in the same widespread suffering as in the previous era. The Han emperors understood that the wall was more than just a stone barrier. It was part of a comprehensive defense system that encompassed diplomacy, military campaigns, and even the migration of peoples. The wall was a symbol of the empire's power and unity, as well as its desire to control territories and trade routes. The wall's length was significantly expanded during the Han Dynasty, reaching, by some estimates, over 10,000 kilometers. It encompassed vast territories, protecting both agricultural lands and important cities. It's important to note that the Great Wall of the Han Dynasty was not a monolithic structure. Rather, it was a system of fortifications comprising walls, moats, forts, outposts, and natural barriers such as mountains and rivers. This made defense more flexible and effective. The strategic placement of these fortifications took into account the terrain and the main directions of potential invasions. This period of wall construction and strengthening laid the foundation for the subsequent development of defensive structures in China. It demonstrated how a wall could be integrated into a broader defensive strategy, how it could be used to protect economic interests, and how it could become a symbol of state power. The Han Dynasty Wall, although modified over time, left an indelible mark on Chinese history and on our understanding of the Great Wall today. It became the embodiment of the desire for security and prosperity that has always been inherent in Chinese civilization. During this period, spanning roughly the 4th to 6th centuries A.D., China experienced a period of fragmentation. The once unified empire fragmented into numerous separate states, each with its own rulers and ambitions. This was a time when central authority weakened, and the various kingdoms that had existed within the formerly unified state began to build their own fortifications. This period, known as the 16 Kingdoms and the Southern and Northern dynasties, saw a revival in defensive wall construction, but not on the same scale as in previous dynasties. These were now more localized fortifications, designed to protect the borders of individual kingdoms from neighbors or from raids by nomadic tribes from the north. Dynasties such as the Northern Wei, Northern Qi, and others devoted attention to wall construction. But each time, these were independent projects, not linked by a unified plan. For example, the Northern Wei dynasty, founded by the Toba tribe, built its fortifications to protect against hostile tribes and to consolidate its power in northern China. These walls were often constructed from local materials, such as rammed earth, stone, and wood. They were not as grandiose as the wall built during the Qin dynasty, but they served their purpose. The Northern Qi dynasty, which succeeded the Northern Wei, also continued these building traditions. They erected walls to protect their territories, especially in the area of modern-day Hebei province. These fortifications were often complemented by watchtowers and forts, creating a network of defensive points. A change in defensive tactics was noticeable during this period. As the unified empire disintegrated, warfare became more localized. Defenses focused on protecting specific cities, regions, or strategically important passes. Walls were built not so much to stop massive armies as to slow down the enemy, provide time to mobilize forces, and protect against surprise raids. Life during this period was difficult. Constant power shifts, wars, and economic hardships were part of everyday life. Building walls required considerable effort and resources. Peasants, artisans, and even soldiers could be recruited for this work. It was hard labor, often performed in harsh weather conditions. Despite the difficulties, building walls also provided employment and a degree of security for the population. Architectural solutions during this period were largely pragmatic. Builders utilized whatever was available in the area. In mountainous areas, stone was used, while in the plains, compacted earth was used. Watchtowers were an important part of the defensive system, allowing for observation of the surrounding area and the signaling of danger. These towers were often located a day's march apart. Although these walls were not part of a single continuous line, they played an important role in the defense of individual states. They symbolized their aspirations for independence and security during turbulent times. The construction of these disparate sections of the wall demonstrates that even during this period of fragmentation, the idea of strengthening borders and protecting territory remained relevant. This was a period of adaptation and the search for new solutions in defensive strategy, when each dynasty sought to secure itself and strengthen its position. Between the decline of the Northern Qi dynasty and the rise of the Sui dynasty, around the end of the 6th century, China experienced another period of change. The empire's borders were unstable, and the need for fortifications remained high, though not as urgent as in earlier times. The scattered sections of walls erected by previous dynasties continued to serve their defensive functions, but they were no longer part of a unified, large-scale project. The Sui dynasty, founded by Emperor Wen of China in 581, succeeded in uniting China after a long period of fragmentation. Emperor Wen of China, whose birth name was Yang Jian, was a pragmatic and far-sighted man. He understood that to consolidate his power and ensure stability, the young state needed secure borders. However, unlike Emperor Qin Shi Huang, who built grandiose walls to protect against external threats, the Sui rulers focused on other aspects of defense. During this period, from 1581 to 618, the Sui dynasty was actively engaged in construction, but the emphasis shifted. Instead of constructing new, extended sections of the Great Wall, they preferred to strengthen and modernize existing structures. This applied to both the northern borders and the interior. New fortresses were built, old walls were repaired, and in some places new ones were erected, although not as extensive as the previous ones. Life during the Sui dynasty was marked by a desire for restoration and development after a period of fragmentation. The Sui emperors implemented a number of important reforms, including the creation of a unified system of examinations for officials, and the construction of the Grand Canal, which linked the north and south of the country. This facilitated trade and cultural exchange, but also required significant human and material resources. The construction of defensive fortifications, although not a top priority, nevertheless continued. The work was carried out primarily by soldiers and state-appointed peasants. Working conditions, as in previous eras, were harsh, but perhaps less grueling than during the reign of Qin Shi Huang, as there was no such massive forced labor on a single gigantic project. Sui dynasty architectural designs reflected a pragmatic approach. They utilized time-tested methods such as rammed earth and stone, but also incorporated new technologies. For example, new types of binders might be used to strengthen foundations and walls. Watchtowers remained an important element, but their design could be improved to allow for better visibility and faster signal transmission. However, despite efforts to strengthen its borders, the Sui dynasty was short-lived. Internal strife and rebellion led to its fall in 618. The Sui were succeeded by the Tang dynasty, which reigned from 618 to 916. The Tang dynasty is considered one of the most brilliant in Chinese history. It was a period of flourishing art, literature, science, and trade. The Tang Empire was vast and powerful, its borders stretching far to the west. Consequently, the defensive strategy of the Tang rulers also underwent changes. The Great Wall, as a single defensive structure, gradually lost its original significance. The main reason for this was that the Tang army was strong and well organized. The Tang Empire preferred active defense and diplomacy rather than passively awaiting attack behind its walls. Its primary efforts were focused on maintaining order within the country and protecting trade routes, especially the Silk Road. Although individual sections of the walls and fortresses continued to be used and repaired, no large-scale new wall construction was undertaken. Instead, the Tang emperors focused more on strengthening border garrisons, constructing forts, and creating mobile army units capable of quickly responding to threats. Intelligence and diplomacy became important tools of foreign policy. Daily life during the Tang period was relatively stable and prosperous for the majority of the population. Cities grew, trade flourished, and culture reached new heights. Peasants farmed, artisans produced goods, and scholars and artists created. Construction work related to defense primarily involved maintaining existing fortifications and building new ones, but no longer on the scale of the Great Wall. These could be small defensive structures, fortresses, or outposts along strategically important routes. The materials and technologies used remained similar to previous periods, but the emphasis was on functionality and speed of construction. Thus, the Sui and Tang dynasties marked a transitional period in the history of the Great Wall. From large-scale construction aimed at protecting against nomadic invasions, the focus shifted to more localized fortifications and active defense. The wall, as a symbol, began to transform, although it remained an important part of the defensive system. This was a time when China, having united and achieved power, sought new ways to ensure its security, relying on the power of the army and diplomacy, not just stone walls. Despite this, the need for fortifications, albeit on a smaller scale, remained, and individual sections of the wall continued to serve their purpose, testifying to the continuity of history and constant adaptation to changing conditions. The Song dynasty, spanning roughly the 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, represents a fascinating chapter in the history of the great Chinese fortress. After a relative lull and a reorientation of defensive strategies in previous eras, the advent of the Song re-emerged, raising the need for defense against powerful northern nomadic peoples. Key adversaries included the Khitans, whose Liao Empire occupied vast territories to the north, and then the Jurchens, who founded the Jin Empire, which eventually absorbed the northern part of the Song Empire. At this time, the Great Wall, as we know it from earlier periods, was no longer a single continuous structure erected by a single dynasty. Rather, it was a system of fortifications, incorporating both ancient sections and new ones, built or repaired to meet current needs. The Song dynasty, founded in 1960, faced serious challenges on its northern borders. Unlike many of its predecessors, the Song dynasty did not possess a powerful land army, making defensive fortifications particularly important. Construction during the Song period focused on strengthening existing defensive lines and constructing new ones, often at strategic mountain passes and at trade route intersections. Materials, as before, varied depending on the terrain: stone, rammed earth, brick. However, compared to the grandiose projects of the Qin or early Han, construction under the Song was generally more localized and smaller scale. This was due not only to economic opportunities, but also to the changing nature of warfare. Nomadic armies became more mobile, and against them, not only static walls were required, but also active defensive maneuvers, well-equipped garrisons, and mobile forces. Everyday life during the Song period was quite developed. The empire was renowned for its economic prosperity, technological advances, and cultural flourishing. Peasants continued to cultivate the land, but urban life became increasingly vibrant. Trade developed, the first paper money appeared, and crafts flourished. During this time, science and art flourished. New literary works were created, and painting was perfected. However, for ordinary people living in border areas, life could be marred by the threat of raids. Watchtowers and small forts built along the walls served as early warning and temporary deterrents. However, despite efforts to maintain and expand the defensive fortifications, the Great Wall gradually lost its former significance as a unified, centralized defensive structure during the Song period. This was due to several factors. First, the adversaries themselves became more powerful. The Liu Empire, and later the Jin Empire, possessed strong armies and an effective military organization. Second, warfare tactics were changing. Nomadic peoples learned to bypass large fortifications by launching swift and surprise raids. Third, the Song dynasty's internal political and economic problems, including corruption and conflicts between various factions, weakened its ability to effectively defend itself. Ultimately, despite the construction and maintenance of defensive lines, the wall was unable to completely prevent invasion. In 1127, the northern capital of the Song Empire fell to the Jurchens, and the dynasty was forced to retreat south, where it founded the southern Song dynasty. This event dealt a serious blow to the empire's prestige and territorial integrity. Even in the south, where defensive fortifications were not as extensive, sections of the wall and other fortifications remained, but their role was largely auxiliary. Thus, the Song dynasty demonstrates that even the most grandiose defensive structures cannot be an absolute guarantee of security, unless they are backed by a strong army, effective policies, and national unity. The wall, although it continued to exist in the form of individual sections and fortifications, was no longer the impenetrable barrier it had been envisioned in earlier times. Rather, it became part of a complex defense system that, unfortunately, proved insufficient to confront powerful enemies. After the Song dynasty, when the Great Wall no longer played such a central role in defense, came the era of Mongol rule. In the 13th century, in 1271, the Mongols, led by Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, founded the Yuan dynasty. This event radically changed the political map of China, and, accordingly, the status and purpose of the Great Wall. The Mongols, coming from the north, already had experience overcoming various defensive lines. Their military strategy was built on mobility, rapid maneuvers, and the use of cavalry. The Great Wall, as a static structure, did not present an insurmountable obstacle for them, especially considering that it had been built and maintained by various dynasties, often in disparate forms. For the Mongols, the wall was not a symbol of a hostile empire to be crushed, but rather part of the existing landscape they now controlled. During the Yuan dynasty, the Great Wall did not undergo large-scale construction or reconstruction, as it had during previous dynasties. The primary focus was on maintaining existing sections that could serve to control territory and the movement of people. However, the wall was no longer seen as the primary line of defense against external enemies. The Mongol Empire stretched over vast territories, and defense was based on different principles, including mobile cavalry armies and a garrison system. Interestingly, during this period, some sections of the wall may have been used for other purposes. For example, they may have served as boundaries for administrative districts or to control nearby trade routes. It's also possible that individual sections of the wall were used as elements of a more complex defensive system, including watchtowers and small forts, but not as a single continuous line. Daily life under the Yuan dynasty had its own unique characteristics. Although the Mongols were conquerors, they sought to govern a vast empire, uniting diverse peoples. Trade flourished in cities such as Khanbalik, modern-day Beijing, attracting merchants from around the world. Travelers such as Marco Polo left behind descriptions of this time, attesting to the empire's cosmopolitan nature. For ordinary people, life went on as usual, engaging in agriculture and crafts, following the traditions of their ancestors. The Great Wall during this period was likely perceived as part of the familiar landscape, rather than as something directly affecting their daily existence. Construction work, if it was carried out, was likely localized, aimed at repairing damaged areas or strengthening strategically important points. The absence of a unified, large-scale construction program, characteristic of the Qin, Han, or Ming dynasties, suggests a shift in priorities. The Mongols, being a largely nomadic people, were not as deeply rooted in agriculture and a sedentary lifestyle as the Chinese, which may have influenced their attitude toward grandiose defensive structures. Thus, the Yuan dynasty marked a time of transformation for the Great Wall. It ceased to be a symbol of intense defensive struggle against nomads, but rather became part of a broader system of control and governance over a vast empire. Its role shifted from a defensive line to an administrative and perhaps auxiliary one. This was a period when the wall continued to exist, but its meaning and function underwent significant changes under the influence of the new regime and its military tactics. The Ming Dynasty, spanning the 14th to 17th centuries, saw the Great Wall's unprecedented flourishing. This was the largest and most ambitious phase of its construction, largely defining its modern appearance. After centuries of relative decline and transformation, the Ming Dynasty once again recognized the vital need for a powerful defensive line capable of protecting the empire from external threats, particularly from the north. The Ming emperors, seeking to strengthen their borders and ensure the stability of their state, set themselves the task of constructing the most impressive and reliable wall ever built. Construction was undertaken on an unprecedented scale, covering thousands of kilometers. The emphasis was not simply on erecting a barrier, but on creating a complex defensive system, including fortresses, watchtowers, barracks, and signal stations. New materials and technologies were actively used in construction. While rammed earth and wood had previously been the predominant materials, brick and stone blocks began to be widely used during the Ming era. This gave walls greater strength and durability. Particular attention was paid to the quality of the masonry. Bricks were made on site, often in specially built kilns, and a durable lime-based mortar was used to bind them. Where possible, walls were constructed from massive stone slabs quarried in nearby quarries. The wall's architecture also underwent significant changes. Instead of simple earthen ramparts that could be easily scaled, tall, thick brick and stone walls emerged. They reached 10 meters in height and could be up to 8 meters wide at the base. This made them virtually impenetrable to infantry and even horsemen. Watchtowers became an integral part of the new defensive system. They were built at regular intervals along the entire wall, serving as observation posts, supply depots, and garrison quarters. These towers had complex structures, often multi-tiered, with loopholes allowing for firing at the enemy. They also served as signals, using smoke during the day and fire at night, allowing for quick warning of approaching danger. Fortresses and outposts were located in strategic locations, such as mountain passes and mountain passes. They were powerful fortifications capable of withstanding a lengthy siege. Inside the fortresses were barracks, warehouses, water wells, and other structures necessary for defense. They served as strongholds for troops and centers of control over the surrounding territories. One of the most famous and well-preserved sections of the wall built during this period is the section at Jiayuguan Pass, located in the west. This was a key defensive point, controlling the entrance to the Gan River Valley. Another significant site is the section at Shanhaiguan Pass, where the wall meets the sea, symbolically enclosing Chinese territory. The construction of the wall during the Ming Dynasty was not only a massive engineering project, but also a tremendous challenge for the population. Millions of people, including soldiers, peasants, and convicts, were mobilized to undertake this titanic task. The work was grueling and dangerous. Weather conditions, especially in remote mountainous areas, were harsh. Transporting building materials, often by hand or with primitive machinery, required colossal effort. Nevertheless, despite the difficulties, construction continued for many decades. It became a symbol of the Ming dynasty's resilience and determination to defend its empire. People living at the time saw the wall not only as a defensive structure, but also as a manifestation of the state's power and stability. For peasants whose lands were protected by the wall, it meant relative safety from nomadic raids. Craftsmen and merchants also benefited from the fortified borders, which facilitated the development of trade and the prosperity of cities. In the daily lives of those living near the wall, it was an integral part of the landscape. Children played at its foot, shepherds grazed their cattle on the hillsides, and travelers used the roads that ran alongside it. Soldiers stationed in towers and forts formed a familiar sight, ensuring security and order. The construction of the wall during the Ming dynasty was more than simply erecting a physical barrier. It was aimed at creating a system that would effectively control borders, monitor the movements of potential enemies, and quickly respond to threats. It was a comprehensive defensive strategy adapted to the conditions of the time. The Great Wall of the Ming Dynasty was the pinnacle of engineering and human fortification. It represented more than just a line of defense, but an entire system of interconnected fortifications stretching for thousands of kilometers. Its construction required the mobilization of enormous resources and effort, but ultimately resulted in one of the most impressive structures in human history, which to this day amazes with its grandeur and symbolizes the eternal quest for security and protection. The 17th century marked a period of testing for the Great Wall of China, and ultimately the decline of its original defensive function. By this time, the Ming dynasty, which had built the most impressive sections of the wall, faced a new, powerful threat from the north, the Manchus. These tribes, united under talented commanders, became a formidable force, capable of challenging the entire empire. The Manchus, who originated from the region known as Manchuria, possessed a well-organized army, distinguished by its mobility and skill in fighting on both horse and foot. Their leader, Nurhaci, succeeded in uniting disparate tribes and creating a unified state. He began his reign in the late 16th century, and by the early 17th he already posed a significant threat to the northern borders of the Ming. The Great Wall, once seemingly impregnable, now found itself confronted by an enemy who had learned to bypass it and exploit its weaknesses. It's important to understand that the Ming Dynasty wall was not a single monolithic structure, but a complex system of fortifications, comprising numerous sections, fortresses, and watchtowers. The success of the defense depended not only on the wall itself, but also on the size and combat readiness of the garrisons, as well as the coordination of actions between the various sections. For a long time, the Ming dynasty successfully held off the nomadic onslaught, but by the early 17th century, the empire had weakened. Internal problems such as corruption, economic hardship, and peasant uprisings drained the state's resources and undermined its defenses. This created favorable conditions for the Manchus. Strategic miscalculations were a major factor in the Ming's fall. For example, When the Manchus launched their main offensives, a significant portion of Chinese troops were concentrated on the southern borders, where threats also existed. This weakened defenses in the north, where the wall should have served as the main barrier. Moreover, defensive tactics along the wall itself became less effective. The Manchus learned to find weak points, use betrayal or bribery to open gates, and bypass heavily fortified sections of the wall. They also employed more modern warfare techniques, including artillery, which, combined with their mobility, made them a very dangerous adversary. A key moment in the fall of the Ming dynasty was the capture of Beijing by the Manchus in 1644. This occurred not so much because of a breach of the wall, but because one of the Chinese generals, Wu Sungui, commanding troops at the key Shanhaiguan Pass, opened the gates to fight rebels within the country, but ultimately allowed the Manchus to enter the capital. This event symbolized the end of the Ming dynasty. After the fall of the Ming dynasty and the establishment of the Qing dynasty, founded by the Manchus, the Great Wall of China lost its original defensive significance. The new dynasty controlled vast territories, including lands north of the wall, so the need for such a large-scale defensive structure disappeared. The wall, which for centuries had served as a defense against external threats, found itself in a new context. However, despite the loss of its primary function, the Great Wall was not completely forgotten. It continued to be an important symbol of Chinese civilization and its history. Over the following centuries, various sections of the wall gradually fell into disrepair, exposed to the elements and human activity. But its image lived on in culture, art, and popular memory. The succession of dynasties and the changing geopolitical situation demonstrated that even the most formidable defensive structures cannot guarantee security if a state is weakened from within and its enemies become stronger and more cunning. The history of the 17th century and the fall of the Ming dynasty provided an important lesson, demonstrating that defense is not only about walls, but also about the unity of a people, wise governance, and the ability to adapt to changing conditions. The Great Wall, as a witness to these events, continues to remind us of the complexity of history and the fragility of human achievement. After the fall of the Ming dynasty and the establishment of the Qing dynasty, founded by the Manchus, the Great Wall of China lost its original defensive significance. The new dynasty controlled vast territories, including lands north of the wall, so the need for such a large-scale defensive structure disappeared. The wall, which for centuries had served as a defense against external threats, found itself in a new context. However, despite the loss of its primary function, the Great Wall was not completely forgotten. It continued to be an important symbol of Chinese civilization and its history. Over the following centuries, various sections of the wall gradually fell into disrepair, exposed to the elements and human activity. But its image lived on in culture, art, and popular memory. The change of dynasties and the changing geopolitical situation demonstrated that even the most grandiose defensive structures cannot guarantee security if a state is weakened from within and its enemies become stronger and more cunning. The history of the 17th century and the fall of the Ming dynasty provided an important lesson, demonstrating that defense is not only about walls, but also about the unity of a people, wise governance, and the ability to adapt to changing conditions. The Great Wall, as a witness to these events, continues to remind us of the complexity of history and the fragility of human achievement. With the advent of the Qing dynasty, which began in 1644, the Great Wall, as already mentioned, lost its former strategic significance. The Manchus, upon coming to power, consolidated under their control the territories the wall had previously been designed to protect. The Qing Empire extended far to the north, encompassing lands previously considered external to Chinese civilization. Therefore, maintaining such a grand defensive structure became less relevant from a military strategy perspective. The garrisons once stationed along the wall were disbanded or transferred elsewhere. Construction work aimed at maintaining and strengthening the wall virtually ceased. However, despite the loss of its defensive function, the Great Wall did not disappear from view. It continued to exist as a monumental testimony to the past, a reminder of centuries of struggle and construction. Gradually, under the influence of natural forces, wind, rain, snow, and temperature fluctuations, sections of the wall began to deteriorate. Stones crumbled, earthen ramparts were undermined, and wooden structures deteriorated. People living near the wall sometimes used its stones to build their homes or outbuildings, which also contributed to its gradual disappearance in some places. Nevertheless, the image of the Great Wall remained alive in culture. It featured in poetry, painting, and folk tales. Historians and scholars of the Qing dynasty, even as Manchus, showed interest in this grandiose structure. They began to study its history, attempting to understand the scale of its construction and its significance for preceding dynasties. This was the period when the wall began to transform from a purely military object into one of cultural and historical significance. By the mid-19th century, with the rise of European powers and their penetration of China, the Great Wall once again attracted attention, but in a different context. Foreign travelers, explorers, and traders began to visit China, and many were amazed by the wall's grandeur and extent. They began writing about it in their diaries and books, spreading word of it throughout the world. For them, the wall became a symbol of an exotic and ancient Chinese civilization. During this period, the first attempts at systematically studying the wall began. Scholars, both Chinese and foreign, began conducting more detailed surveys. They mapped sections of the wall, studied its architecture, and attempted to determine the age of its various sections. These studies helped better understand the construction history and evolution of the wall over the centuries. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when China was experiencing significant social and political upheaval, the Great Wall became the focus of its first restoration efforts. Although these works were still very limited and not always carried out with a proper scientific approach, they marked the beginning of the process of preserving the wall for future generations. Early enthusiasts and government officials recognized the importance of preserving this unique monument. During this period, the daily lives of those living near the wall continued as usual, but with a new awareness of the significance of this ancient structure. Farmers continued to cultivate their lands. Merchants conducted their business, But now the wall, which had once defined the boundaries of their world, became part of their identity, a symbol of their land and history. Sometimes, in the quiet countryside where the ancient fortifications ran, children could be seen playing among the stones, unconcerned with the wall's former military purpose, but experiencing its presence as something natural, part of the landscape. It's important to note that even during this period of decline and neglect, the wall continued to play a role in the lives of the local population. In some areas where the wall was well preserved, it was used as a road or landmark. Local residents knew which sections of the wall were strong and which were beginning to crumble. They could use it as a source of building material, but also as a natural barrier separating fields or villages. Contemporary explorers, such as the British geographer and explorer Francis Younghusband, noted in their descriptions that despite its destruction, the wall still left an indelible impression. He described how, upon climbing one section of the wall, one could see endless expanses stretching to the horizon and feel the breath of time. These descriptions contributed to a growing interest in the wall beyond China. By the early 20th century, as China faced the threat of foreign intervention and internal conflict, the idea of preserving national identity and cultural heritage became especially important. The Great Wall, one of China's most recognizable symbols, became a focal point. The first organizations and initiatives aimed at its study and preservation began to emerge. This period was one of transition. The wall was no longer a functioning defensive structure, but its significance as a cultural and historical monument was only just beginning to be recognized. It had become an object that required protection and study, so as to be passed on to future generations. This was a time when the wall's past began to acquire new meaning in the context of a changing present. It's important to understand that the wall's decline and transformation was not uniform. It unfolded differently in different sections, depending on geographic conditions, population density, and political circumstances. Some sections, located in remote mountainous areas, were better preserved, while others, located near populated areas, suffered greater destruction or were dismantled. Nevertheless, the overall trend was clear. The Great Wall, as a military structure, was fading into obscurity, giving way to its new purpose, as a guardian of history and a symbol of Chinese civilization. This process was slow and gradual, spanning centuries, and continued until the 20th century, when more extensive and systematic conservation and restoration efforts began. Thus, the Qing dynasty became a key stage in the history of the Great Wall of China, marking its transition from a defensive structure to a cultural and historical heritage site. Despite losing its original purpose, the wall continued to live in the public consciousness, acquiring new meanings and attracting the attention of explorers and travelers. This transition laid the foundation for the wall's continued preservation and popularization in subsequent centuries. The Great Wall in the 20th and 21st centuries. Preservation, restoration, and symbolic significance. The Great Wall as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and its tourist attraction. The Great Wall of China's transformation from a defensive structure to a national symbol and a site of global significance was a gradual process spanning centuries. While the wall began to lose its military purpose during the Qing dynasty, this process took on a new dimension in the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, particularly after the fall of the Qing Empire in 1912, China was undergoing a period of profound change. The country sought to modernize and find its place in the new world order. In this context, the Great Wall, as one of the most magnificent creations of the past, began to attract attention not only as a historical monument, but also as a symbol of national identity and resilience. The first steps towards preserving the wall were tentative and often localized. Local authorities and enthusiasts attempted to protect the most significant sections from destruction caused by natural factors and human activity. However, the lack of a unified government policy and financial resources slowed these efforts. Many sections of the wall, constructed of rammed earth and wood, continued to deteriorate under the influence of time and the elements. The situation began to change in the second half of the 20th century. After the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the government began to pay greater attention to preserving cultural heritage. The Great Wall, as one of the most recognizable creations of Chinese civilization, became the center of this attention. In the mid-20th century, the first attempts at systematic study and restoration were undertaken. The work was led by Chinese archaeologists and engineers who sought to understand not only the wall's historical value, but also the technical aspects of its construction. Of particular importance for the wall's preservation was its international recognition. In 1987, the Great Wall of China was inscribed on the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization (UNESCO) World Heritage List. This event marked a turning point. Its World Heritage status brought the wall to the attention of the global community, facilitated increased funding for restoration work, and stimulated the development of international tourism. UNESCO recognition meant that the wall was recognized as a site of exceptional universal value, deserving protection for all humanity. This placed responsibility for its preservation on China, but also opened new opportunities for cooperation with international organizations and the involvement of expert knowledge. A more active restoration period began, covering many sections of the wall, including those that had been destroyed or were in poor condition. Restoration work during this period became more scientific and thoughtful. Traditional materials and methods were used whenever possible to preserve the building's authenticity as much as possible. However, modern technologies were also employed to strengthen the structures and protect them from further deterioration. For example, in some areas where the brickwork was damaged, a special cement mortar was used that imitated the original but was more durable. It's important to note that restoration didn't always mean a complete restoration of the original appearance. Often, the goal was to preserve what remained and prevent further deterioration. In some cases, sections of the wall built of rammed earth were reinforced with stonework to prolong their life. These decisions generated debate among experts, but they were dictated by the need to preserve the wall for future generations. Parallel to its restoration, the Great Wall began to actively develop as a tourist attraction. The most famous and restored sections, such as Badaling, Mutianyu, and Jinshanling, located near Beijing, became popular destinations for tourists from around the world. Tourism generated significant revenue, which, in turn, was partly used to support the wall's continued preservation. The daily lives of those visiting the wall are vastly different from those who built it centuries ago. Today, tourists come here to experience history, sense the scale of this grandiose structure, and enjoy the picturesque views. They can walk the stone steps, feel the coolness of the ancient stones, and imagine the guards who stood guard here centuries ago. For many, visiting the Great Wall is a kind of pilgrimage, an opportunity to touch something eternal and unchanging. However, mass tourism has also created new challenges for the wall's preservation. Large numbers of visitors put pressure on the fragile structures, causing erosion and deterioration. Therefore, Chinese authorities and UNESCO are working to develop sustainable tourism strategies that will balance the economic benefits of tourism with the need to preserve the wall. This includes limiting the number of visitors to certain sections, developing environmentally friendly modes of transport, and educating tourists. The symbolic significance of the Great Wall continues to grow in the 20th and 21st centuries. It has become one of China's most recognizable symbols worldwide, representing not only its ancient history, but also a modern country striving to preserve its heritage while simultaneously developing. The wall symbolizes perseverance, resilience, and the human capacity for great achievements. It reminds us of past hardships and the importance of valuing peace and stability. Research on the wall continues. Archaeologists and historians are working to better understand its history, the various stages of construction, and its role in defense for various dynasties. New technologies such as remote sensing and 3D modeling allow for the exploration of hard-to-reach areas and the discovery of new information about the wall's construction and history. Thus, in the 20th and 21st centuries, the Great Wall has evolved from a forgotten defensive structure to a site of global significance, actively preserved and restored, a source of pride for the Chinese people, and an object of admiration for the entire world. Its history continues, and each new day brings new discoveries and new ways to preserve this unique monument of human civilization. The wall remains a living testimony to the past, inviting us to reflect on eternity, human labor, and the desire for security that unites us all. The Great Wall, towering over the centuries, holds not only stones and labor, but also countless stories, legends, and myths. These tales, like quiet rivers, flow through the fabric of time, reflecting the dreams, fears, and beliefs of the people who lived at the foot of this colossal structure. Today, we will delve into the world of these stories to understand how they shaped culture and art, and how the wall itself became a source of inspiration for generations. Among the most famous legends are those about the superhuman effort required for its construction. It is said that in ancient times, when the first sections of the wall were just beginning to be built, workers toiled day and night, barely sleeping. Their emaciated bodies seemed to merge with the earth, and their prayers for the completion of their work echoed in every gust of wind. One such story tells of a young woman named Meng Jiangniu. Her husband was drafted to help build the wall, and when she had not heard from him for a long time, she set out to search for him. After traveling thousands of li, she found only a pile of bones. Her grief was so great that, according to legend, the wall collapsed at that point, revealing her husband's remains. This story, though more folklore than historical fact, captures the depth of grief and sacrifice associated with construction. It shows how personal tragedies were intertwined with grandiose national projects. Other legends tell of wise generals and emperors who, like master architects of fate, directed the construction. They are credited not only with military strategy, but also with a mystical understanding of the earth and sky, allowing them to select the best sites for fortifications. It was believed that the earth itself breathes, and the wall should be built in harmony with its rhythms. These images of rulers possessing supernatural wisdom helped justify the enormous costs and difficulties associated with construction, presenting it as the will of higher powers. One cannot ignore the stories of the spirits that the ancients believed inhabited these lands. The spirits of the mountains and rivers were said to aid or hinder the builders, depending on how respectfully they were treated. Some legends claim that the souls of those who died during its construction were imprisoned within the stones of the wall, and that these souls continue to guard it to this day. These beliefs imbued the wall with not only physical but also spiritual strength, making it more than just a defensive structure. It became a living organism connected to the spirit world. Stories about the wall's use in times of peace are also fascinating. Although its primary purpose was defensive, it also served as an important communication route. Legend has it that merchant caravans traveled along it, transporting silk, spices, and other valuable goods. Imagine, in ancient times, under the starry sky, lines of camels slowly trudging along the wall's crest, illuminating the way with torches. These images portray the wall not only as a symbol of war, but also as an artery connecting distant lands. The influence of these legends on culture and art is invaluable. The Great Wall became an inexhaustible source of inspiration for Chinese poets, artists, and writers. In poetry, it often appears as a symbol of perseverance, solitude, and eternity. The image of the wall stretching to the horizon evokes a sense of immensity and grandeur. In painting, it is often depicted against the backdrop of majestic landscapes, emphasizing its harmony with nature. Artists sought to convey not only its physical might, but also its mystical aura. In literature, legends about the construction and defense of the wall were reflected in historical novels and folk tales. These works, passed down from generation to generation, helped preserve the memory of the past and pass on its lessons. They told of the heroism of ordinary soldiers, the wisdom of commanders, and the sacrifice of women. These stories shaped national identity, emphasizing the importance of unity and the defense of one's land. Even in contemporary art, the Great Wall continues to inspire. It appears in films, music, and even computer games. Its image is used to represent strength, resilience, and ancient wisdom. Each new artist and writer finds something unique in it, reinterpreting its meaning in a contemporary context. It's important to note that many of these legends, though seemingly fantastical, have a basis in reality. They reflect the genuine difficulties faced by the people building the wall. Fear of the enemy, physical exhaustion, the bitterness of loss, all were real. And it was these real experiences, refracted through the prism of popular imagination, that gave rise to such vivid and memorable stories. For example, stories of forced labor, though not always framed in a mystical form, were a harsh reality. Millions of people, from peasants to soldiers, were mobilized for construction. Their living conditions were harsh and discipline was strict. The mortality rate among the workers was high, and many actually left their bones in the ground at the foot of the wall. Legends, such as the story of Meng Zhengnu, merely exaggerate this tragedy, making it more relatable and emotionally relatable. It's also interesting how some legends are associated with specific sections of the wall or specific historical periods. For example, stories about the construction of the Qin dynasty wall often emphasize the cruelty of Emperor Qin Shi Huang, who is believed to have used the harshest methods to achieve his goals. In contrast, legends about the Ming Dynasty wall, a later and more extensive structure, may emphasize the engineering skill and organization of the builders. Over time, as the wall ceased to fulfill its direct defensive function, its meaning began to transform. It evolved from a military objective into a symbol, a national treasure. And it was during this period that its mythological image became even more vivid. People began to see it not simply as a wall, but as the embodiment of the nation's spirit, its history, and its aspirations. The legends and myths associated with the Great Wall are more than just curious anecdotes. They are an integral part of its essence. They help us understand how people living in different eras perceived this magnificent structure. They reveal how human imagination and beliefs intertwined with real events, creating a unique cultural layer. These stories, like ancient frescoes, adorn the walls of time, making the Great Wall not just an architectural monument, but a living testimony to human history, filled with labor, faith, and dreams. They live on, enriching our understanding of this magnificent creation and reminding us of those who stood at its origins. The Great Wall is more than just a defensive structure, but also a grand monument to human labor, engineering, and history. Every stone, every curve holds echoes of bygone eras, testament to the tenacity and ingenuity of people who lived long before us. In previous conversations, we traced its construction, from the first scattered fortifications to the mighty walls of the Ming Dynasty. Today, we'll delve into the details, exploring the architecture and engineering solutions that allowed this wonder of the world to endure for centuries, changing and adapting to the challenges of time. Our goal is to explore how technological advances and available materials shaped the wall's appearance at each stage of its long life, and how this impacted the daily lives of those who built and defended it. A journey into the construction of the Great Wall begins with its earliest predecessors. During the Warring States period, roughly from the 5th to 3rd centuries BCE, disparate Chinese states erected their own defensive lines. These early walls were more modest in scale than those we know today, But they already served a defensive function. Construction was primarily made from local materials. Where the terrain permitted, rammed earth was used. This method, known as hangtu, involved compacting the soil layer by layer. Earth was brought in and piled up in layers, each layer carefully compacted with wooden or stone hammers. This technology allowed for the creation of walls strong and stable enough to withstand the onslaught of enemy cavalry and infantry. In areas where the ground was loose or rocky, stones were used. Large boulders were stacked on top of one another, often without the use of mortar, relying on the weight and shape of the stones for stability. In some cases, especially in the steppe regions, wooden structures were also used, although they were less durable. People's lives during this period were closely linked to the constant threat of war. Peasants, artisans, and warriors all felt the burden of conflict. The construction of fortifications was part of this harsh reality. Work was typically carried out in times of peace or truces, but construction often continued during periods of relative calm in order to prepare for future conflicts. Working conditions were harsh, but not as brutal as in later periods. The bulk of the workforce consisted of peasants, who were recruited for construction as part of their obligations to the state. A true breakthrough in the history of the Great Wall's construction occurred with the rise to power of Emperor Qin Shi Huang in the 3rd century BC. He united the disparate sections and began construction of a single extended defensive line, designed to protect the newly unified state from nomadic invasions from the north. This was a massive undertaking, requiring colossal resources and human effort. The wall's strategic significance was obvious. It was intended to become an impenetrable barrier, control trade routes, and prevent raids. Construction under Qin Shi Huang became synonymous with forced labor. Millions of people, including soldiers, prisoners, and ordinary peasants, were conscripted. Imperial decrees required every adult male to work a certain amount of time on the construction site. This meant that entire families could be left without a breadwinner for months, even years. Working conditions were appalling. Work was carried out in harsh climates, often in remote and sparsely populated areas. Food shortages, disease, and accidents were commonplace. Many died on the construction site, and their bodies were often buried right at the base of the wall, giving rise to grim legends about ghost builders. The materials used during the Qin dynasty largely replicated those of previous periods, but on a much larger scale. Rammed earth remained the primary method, but it was now used to create massive, high embankments. In mountainous regions, stones were extensively used, which were painstakingly fitted together. To support the high rammed earth embankment, it was often reinforced on the sides with wooden beams and poles. In some areas where stone was abundant, walls were constructed from roughly hewn blocks. The technologies were simple, but they required enormous labor and time. Nevertheless, it was these early walls, built at the cost of incredible suffering, that laid the foundation for future, even more magnificent structures. After the fall of the Qin dynasty, construction of the wall did not cease completely. The Han dynasty, which came to power in the 2nd century BCE, continued and significantly expanded the fortifications. The Han Dynasty emperors recognized the importance of the wall for protecting the northern borders and, most importantly, for ensuring the security of the Silk Road. This trade route, connecting China with the West, was vital to the empire's economy. The wall helped control the movement of caravans, protect them from nomadic raids, and maintain stability along the trade routes. The Han Dynasty saw the emergence of new technologies and architectural solutions. Builders became more skilled in the use of brick, especially in areas where it could be produced. Brick walls were stronger and more durable than earthen ones, allowing for taller, more level structures. Brick was often used to face the top of earthen embankments, giving the wall a finished appearance and additional strength. Stone blocks, carefully fitted together, also came into widespread use. An important innovation was the construction of watchtowers. The towers were placed at regular intervals along the wall, allowing lookouts to maintain 24-hour surveillance and quickly transmit alarms using smoke during the day and fire at night. These towers served not only as observation posts, but also as weapons and food storage areas, as well as shelters for the garrisons. Their design was thoughtful. They often had 2 or 3 tiers, with loopholes facing in different directions. The towers could also house living quarters for soldiers. Life along the wall during the Han Dynasty was marked by constant vigilance. Garrisons of soldiers stood guard, watching over the steps. Traders traveling along the Silk Road relied on the wall's protection. Ordinary residents of the border regions lived under constant threat, but they also knew the wall was their primary defense. Building and maintaining the wall required constant effort, and the bulk of the workforce still consisted of soldiers and conscripted peasants. The period of fragmentation following the Han Dynasty led to a fragmentation of defensive fortifications. From the 4th to 6th centuries A.D., when China was divided into several kingdoms, various dynasties such as the Northern Wei, Northern Qi, and Northern Zhou built their own sections of the wall. These walls often served to protect specific territories or to mark the boundaries between warring states. Defensive tactics also began to change. Instead of a single continuous line, the emphasis shifted to creating fortified lines consisting of a series of walls, forts, and observation posts located at strategic heights. The materials used during this period varied and depended on local conditions. In some regions, rammed earth continued to be widely used, especially where large amounts of soil were available. In other areas, particularly in mountainous regions, stone was preferred. Construction was carried out with consideration for the terrain, utilizing natural barriers such as mountains and rivers as part of the defensive system. During this period, people's daily lives were precarious. Constant wars between kingdoms led to destruction and displacement. The population lived in fear of attack, and building fortifications was a matter of survival. Labor for the walls was often recruited from the local population, who were forced to participate under threat of punishment. Nevertheless, these walls, although not as extensive as those of previous dynasties, played an important role in protecting individual regions and shaping the military tactics of the time. A brief revival of Great Wall construction occurred during the Sui and Tang dynasties, from the 6th to the 9th centuries CE. The Sui emperors, seeking to unify the country, undertook efforts to restore and strengthen existing sections of the wall, as well as build new ones. However, unlike previous dynasties, the Tang, known for its openness and powerful military, relied more on military might and diplomacy than on static defensive structures. Construction during the Sui dynasty was large-scale, but often temporary. New sites were built, old ones were restored, but the emphasis shifted. Instead of an extended line of defense, more attention was paid to creating powerful fortresses and outposts located at strategic points. The materials used during this period varied. Along with traditional rammed earth and stone, brick became increasingly important, especially in areas where its production was established. During the Tang dynasty, the wall as a single defensive line lost its primary importance. The Tang Empire was strong and expanding its borders, reducing the need for massive defensive fortifications on its northern borders. However, individual sections of the wall continued to be maintained and reinforced, particularly in areas where the threat from northern nomadic tribes remained. Life in the border regions remained tense, but overall, the Tang period was a time of relative peace and prosperity for most of the empire. The Song dynasty, which ruled from the 10th to the 13th centuries AD, faced serious challenges from powerful northern nomadic empires such as the Liao, Jin, and Mongol empires. Defense against these warlike peoples became a primary concern. The wall, as a centralized defensive structure, played a significant role, but its effectiveness was limited. Construction during the Song dynasty focused on strengthening existing sections and constructing new ones, but these efforts were often reactive, responding to current threats. The Song emperors sought to build stronger and higher walls, using more stone and brick. New forts and towers were built to slow the advance of enemy armies. However, despite these efforts, the wall was not always able to stop well-organized and mobile nomadic armies. An important aspect of defense during the Song dynasty was not only the construction of the wall, but also the development of a system of forts, garrisons, and signal stations. These elements created a multi-layered defense system designed to warn of attack and mobilize troops. However, the wall itself, being a static structure, often proved vulnerable to powerful attacks. Life during this period was marked by constant anxiety. Nomadic raids were a frequent and visible occurrence, bringing destruction and suffering. Peasants living near the wall were frequently victims of looting. Military garrisons performed difficult duties, constantly on guard. Despite the heroic efforts of the defenders, the Song dynasty ultimately fell to the Mongol onslaught. The period of Mongol rule, the Yuan dynasty, from the 13th to the 14th centuries AD, brought with it a dramatic change in the status of the Great Wall. The Mongols, being nomadic themselves, did not see the wall as having the same defensive significance as the Chinese dynasties. Moreover, their empire extended far beyond the wall's traditional boundaries, making it less relevant as a single defensive line. During the Yuan dynasty, many sections of the wall were abandoned and fell into disrepair. The Mongol rulers focused primarily on maintaining order in their vast empire, rather than strengthening the old defensive lines. However, some sections of the wall, particularly those running through important strategic points or serving to control the local population, continued to be maintained. The Mongols utilized the existing fortifications for their own needs, but did not undertake large-scale construction projects. The Mongol military tactics also differed from those of their predecessors. They relied on mobility, speed, and surprise attacks rather than protracted sieges. Therefore, a static wall did not always serve their strategic purposes. Nevertheless, certain sections of the wall and the fortresses built on them continued to play a role in controlling vast territories and suppressing rebellions. Life during the Yuan dynasty was marked by a fusion of cultures and traditions. Mongol rule brought new customs, but also a period of relative stability after years of war. However, for many Chinese, the loss of national independence and the upheaval of their traditional way of life were a difficult ordeal. The wall, once a symbol of their defense, now served as a reminder of their lost strength. The Great Wall's revival and flourishing occurred during the Ming Dynasty, from the 14th to the 17th centuries A.D. Recognizing the threat posed by northern nomads, particularly the Mongols, the Ming emperors undertook unprecedented efforts to restore, strengthen, and expand the wall. This phase of construction became the most extensive and grandiose in the wall's history, transforming it into the monumental structure we know today. The Ming Dynasty rebuilt and fortified virtually all existing sections, and also erected new, extended lines that traversed the most dangerous and strategically important areas. The primary focus was on creating a powerful and continuous defense. New, more durable materials were employed. Brick became the primary building material, especially for wall cladding and tower construction. Stone blocks were also widely used, but now they were more carefully crafted and laid. The architectural designs of the Ming Dynasty were astonishingly developed. The wall became taller and wider, often reaching 10 meters in height and 7 meters in width at the base. Thousands of watchtowers were built at regular intervals, each capable of housing a small garrison and serving as an observation post. These towers were not simply square or rectangular, but often had complex shapes, with loopholes, canopies, and even small courtyards. Particular attention was paid to the construction of fortresses and outposts. Powerful fortresses such as Shanhaiguan in the east and Jiayuguan in the west served as key defensive points, controlling passes and important roads. These fortresses were veritable miniature cities, complete with barracks, warehouses, temples, and residential quarters for the garrison. The lives of people in the Ming Dynasty, especially in border regions, were closely linked to the wall. Soldiers endured long and arduous service maintaining the defense. Peasants lived under constant threat, but also knew the wall was their shield. Building the wall required enormous resources and labor, placing a heavy burden on the population. However, through an organized approach and the use of new technologies, the Ming Dynasty managed to create the most impressive defensive line in history. The defense against the Manchus and the fall of the Ming Dynasty marked the final dramatic stage in the history of the Great Wall as a defensive structure. Despite all the efforts of the Ming Dynasty to strengthen the wall, it was unable to completely stem the onslaught of the Manchu tribes. In the early 17th century, as the Manchus began to gain strength, the wall found itself on the front line of defense. The Ming Dynasty invested enormous resources and effort into maintaining and strengthening the wall. New towers were built, existing fortifications were improved, and garrisons were strengthened. However, internal problems within the dynasty, such as corruption, political instability, and economic difficulties, weakened its ability to effectively manage its defenses. Strategic miscalculations also played a role. In the 17th century, during the reign of the Changqiren Emperor, the Manchus discovered a gap in their defenses. In 1644, General Wu Sengui, commander of a key section of the wall at Shanhaigan, opened the gates to admit troops intended to assist him in fighting the rebels. Instead, the Manchus seized this opportunity to penetrate into Chinese territory and ultimately capture Beijing, leading to the fall of the Ming Dynasty. The wall, built to protect against external enemies, proved incapable of preventing internal collapse. Although individual sections of the wall continued to be used for territorial control and to suppress rebellions, its significance as an impenetrable defensive line was lost. Life during this period was marked by chaos, war, and change. The fall of the Ming Dynasty and the establishment of Manchu rule marked the end of an era in which the Great Wall had been the Chinese people's main hope for security. With the rise of the Qing Dynasty in the 17th century, the Great Wall finally lost its defensive significance. The Manchus, being outsiders themselves, saw no need for such massive fortifications against their neighbors. Their empire grew even more expansive, and the emphasis shifted to governing vast territories rather than defending the old borders. During the Qing dynasty, many sections of the wall fell into disrepair. Bricks and stones were used for other structures, and the earthen embankments eroded under the influence of time and nature. However, the wall was not completely forgotten. It began to transform into a cultural landmark. European explorers, travelers, and scholars arriving in China were astonished by the scale of this structure. They began to study it, draw maps, and write descriptions. The first attempts to restore the wall began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Qing government, recognizing the wall's historical and cultural value, took some steps to preserve it. However, these efforts were limited and could not halt the overall process of deterioration. People's lives during this period were marked by both tradition and growing Western influence. The wall, once a symbol of defense, was now becoming an object of interest to the entire world. The Great Wall of China in the 20th and 21st centuries is a story of preservation, restoration, and symbolic significance. After years of neglect and decay, larger-scale restoration work began in the mid-20th century. The government of the People's Republic of China recognized its significance as a national symbol and World Heritage Site. Extensive restoration work was carried out, particularly in the best-preserved sections, such as Badaling, Mutianyu, and Jinshanling. These sections were restored and prepared for tourism. Traditional materials and construction methods were used to preserve the structure's authenticity as much as possible. In 1987, the Great Wall was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List, highlighting its unique value to all humanity. The wall has become one of the most recognizable symbols of China and one of the most popular tourist destinations in the world. Millions of people visit it annually, marveling at its scale and history. Today, the Great Wall is not just an architectural monument, but also a living reminder of a heroic past and the resilience and tenacity of the human spirit. It symbolizes not only defense, but also the desire for security and the creation of a protected space. Its image has become ingrained in global culture, embodying grandeur and longevity. Legends and myths associated with the Great Wall are woven like threads into its fabric, making its image even more vibrant and mysterious. They tell stories of its construction, of heroes, and even of the spirits believed to guard it. These stories, passed down from generation to generation, help us understand how people living in different eras perceived this grandiose structure. For example, the legend of Meng Jianyu, whose tears are said to have destroyed a section of the wall built by her husband, who died during the construction, is widely known. This story highlights the tragic side of construction and the suffering it brought. Other legends tell of wise generals who used the wall to protect the country, or of spirits who aided the builders. These stories are not mere fiction. They reflect the beliefs, fears, and hopes of the people who lived alongside the wall. They help us see the wall not only as a stone structure, but also as part of people's spiritual lives. The wall's influence on culture and art is undeniable. It has inspired countless artists, writers, and poets, becoming the subject of their work. Its image is present in painting, literature, and cinema, symbolizing power, resilience, and eternity. The architecture and engineering solutions used in the construction of the Great Wall are striking in their diversity and ingenuity, evolving over the centuries. From simple earthen embankments to complex brick structures, each stage of construction reflected the technological advancement and available materials of the era. In the early stages, during the Warring States period, the primary method was the use of rammed earth, or hangtu. The soil was compacted layer by layer, creating strong walls. In mountainous regions, stones were used, stacked one on top of the other. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, who unified China, continued these methods, but on a much larger scale, mobilizing millions of people. Rammed earth remained the primary material, but was often reinforced with wooden elements. The Han Dynasty introduced significant innovations. Brick became widely used, especially in areas where it could be produced. Brick walls were stronger and more durable. More sophisticated watchtower designs were developed for observation and signaling. Towers often had multiple tiers and were equipped with loopholes. During the period of fragmentation, construction became more fragmented, but also more adaptive to the terrain. Builders utilized natural barriers, such as mountains and rivers, as part of their defensive systems. Stones and rammed earth were used, depending on local conditions. The Ming Dynasty achieved a real breakthrough. The wall became grandiose, extended, and powerful. Brick became the primary material used for wall cladding, towers, and fortresses. Complex drainage systems were developed to prevent the wall from eroding. Towers became more varied in form and functionality, some of which could house hundreds of soldiers. Fortresses like Shanhaiguan were true fortification complexes with multi-layered defenses. Ming Dynasty engineering solutions included the creation of wide platforms on top of the wall, allowing soldiers to move freely and fight. Loopholes were provided for archery and firearms. The use of mortar, composed of lime and glutinous rice, provided additional strength to the brickwork. The Great Wall is more than just a stone barrier, but a living testimony to history, a symbol of the resilience of the human spirit and the eternal search for security. It has endured through millennia, changing and adapting, but always remaining a beacon reminding us of the past. Today, as a World Heritage Site, it continues to inspire and teach us. Its future lies in its preservation and careful management. The wall reminds us that security and prosperity are achieved through hard work, wisdom, and unity. It is a symbol of humanity's striving to protect itself and its values. Reflecting on the Great Wall, we see not only a magnificent structure, but also a reflection of our own history, our aspirations, and our eternal search for a better future. The Great Wall is more than just a stone barrier. It is a living testimony to history, a symbol of the resilience of the human spirit and the eternal search for security. It has endured for millennia, changing and adapting, yet always remaining, a beacon reminding us of the past. Today, as a World Heritage Site, it continues to inspire and teach us. Its future lies in its preservation and care. The wall reminds us that security and prosperity are achieved through hard work, wisdom, and unity. It is a symbol of humanity's striving to protect itself and its values. When we reflect on the Great Wall, we see not only a magnificent structure, but also a reflection of our own history, our aspirations, and our eternal search for a better future. Over the centuries, like the gentle flow of a river, the Great Wall has witnessed the change of dynasties, the birth and decline of empires. It witnessed the emergence of the first fragmented defensive lines in the 5th century BCE during the turbulent times of the warring states. Back then, between the 5th and 3rd centuries BCE, builders used readily available materials, rammed earth, wood, and stone. These early fortifications were a response to the pressing need for protection from raids by nomadic tribes from the north. Every stone, every embankment was laid with the preservation of a fragile peace and tranquility in mind. Then, in the 3rd century BCE, came Emperor Qin Shi Huang. He united the disparate parts, beginning construction of the first unified Great Wall. It was a grandiose but also brutal undertaking. Millions of people, soldiers, and ordinary peasants were mobilized for this work. Their labor was grueling, the conditions harsh. The history of this wall's construction is marked not only by its scale, but also by human tragedies. However, it was then that the image of the wall we know today as a symbol of unity and power was born. The Han Dynasty, from the 2nd century BCE to the 2nd century CE, continued and expanded the work of its predecessors. The wall became even longer and more robust. It served as a reliable defense, not only for agricultural lands, but also for trade routes, primarily the legendary Silk Road. New technologies, such as the use of fired brick and more sophisticated architectural solutions, allowed for the creation of more durable and effective defensive structures. Towers and guard posts became an integral part of the landscape, symbolizing vigilance and readiness for defense. During periods of fragmentation from the 4th to 6th centuries AD, when central authority weakened, various dynasties, such as the Northern Wei and Northern Qi, built their own sections of the wall. These were more local fortifications designed to protect specific regions. Defense tactics evolved, and the wall adapted to new challenges, demonstrating its flexibility as a defensive structure. The Sui and Tang dynasties, from the 6th to the 9th centuries AD, saw a brief revival of interest in the wall, but then its importance gradually faded. The focus of defense shifted, and the wall ceased to be the primary element of strategic defense. During the Song dynasty, from the 10th to the 13th centuries, the wall regained its importance in defense against northern nomads. However, its capabilities were limited, and a centralized defense system could no longer fully ensure security. The Mongol rule of the Yuan dynasty, from the 13th to the 14th centuries, brought different military tactics. The wall, built to protect against nomads, proved less effective against the new mobile army. Its role was transformed, becoming more of a symbol than a real obstacle. A new era of Renaissance dawned with the Ming dynasty, from the 14th to the 17th centuries. This period marked the largest and most ambitious in the history of the Great Wall's construction. New, more durable materials were employed, most notably brick, which became the primary material for wall cladding, towers, and forts. Complex drainage systems were developed to prevent the wall from deteriorating due to erosion. Towers became more varied in form and functionality, some of which could house hundreds of soldiers. Fortresses such as Shanhaiguan were true fortification complexes with multi-layered defenses. Ming engineering solutions included the creation of wide platforms atop the wall, allowing soldiers to move freely and conduct combat. Loopholes were provided for archery and firearms. The use of mortar, composed of lime and glutinous rice, provided additional strength to the brickwork. However, even the most formidable wall could not stop all threats. In the 17th century, during the confrontation with the Manchus, the wall played a role, but strategic miscalculations and internal problems of the Ming dynasty led to its fall. Despite heroic resistance, the wall failed to become an insurmountable barrier. The Qing dynasty, from the 17th to the 20th centuries, marked the loss of the Great Wall's defensive significance. The Qing Empire expanded beyond its borders, and the wall became a cultural landmark. The first research and restoration efforts began, and tourism gradually began to attract attention. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the Great Wall was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Efforts to preserve and restore it continue. The wall has become not only a historical monument, but also a powerful symbol, attracting millions of tourists from around the world. Legends and myths associated with the wall's construction live on in popular memory. Stories of heroes, spirits, and the incredible efforts of the builders all lend the wall a mystical aura. It inspires artists, writers, and poets, becoming part of global culture. The architectural and engineering solutions used during the wall's construction at various stages are striking in their ingenuity. From simple earthen embankments to complex brick structures with extensive drainage systems and defensive fortifications, each stage of construction reflects the level of knowledge and capabilities of its time. The Great Wall is more than just a collection of stones and bricks. It is the embodiment of the human desire for security, a symbol of perseverance and resilience. It reminds us that history is not a static picture, but a constantly evolving process. The wall, which once served as a defense, today is a bridge connecting the past and the present, cultures and peoples. Its future lies in its careful preservation, study, and the transmission of its lessons to future generations. It reminds us of the importance of unity, of the need to work together for the common good, and that even the most ambitious tasks can be accomplished with wisdom, will, and determination. May its grandeur and tranquility be a source of peace and calm for you.